This is a Psychology Today cassette, one in a series of interviews and special presentations featuring contemporary clinicians, researchers, and educators discussing their work in the behavioral and social sciences. Today, editorial director Margie Norman talks to Robert B. Cialdini, a social psychologist who has spent several years observing fundraisers, advertisers, salespersons, and other so-called compliance professionals to learn how they get us to comply with their wishes. In this presentation, Professor Cialdini outlines their most effective methods, shows us how to resist them when we want to, and how to use similarly persuasive techniques honestly and ethically.
Professor Cialdini, most of us probably aren't particularly aware of how often we make choices based upon decisions that are not totally rational, that aren't based upon thorough thinking out of all the effects of those decisions. Other people have ways of influencing our decisions that we may be completely unaware of. And you call these psychological prompts, and they elicit the click-whir phenomenon. Can you explain what psychological prompts are and what you mean by click-whir?
Well, I have just completed a long program of investigation into the factors that are most likely to cause one person to say yes to another person. And what I found in that investigation, which, by the way, involved going out into the real world and examining the way the people who are in the business of getting others to say yes, what those people do to be effective. In the process of examining those strategies that are often employed in very effective ways by the compliance professionals or the influence professionals, it seemed to me that there were a very few basic principles that stood out that almost all of the individuals who are effective influencers use. And each one of these principles can be seen as a kind of stimulus that gets someone else to say yes. Let me give you an example, one that I think we'll talk about a little later. Authority. If someone has the air of authority about him or her, then whatever that person says is more likely to produce a kind of agreement, a deference from the target of that communication, and more likely to produce compliance with a request that the authority makes of that individual. So simply a little trigger feature of the person, like the air of authority that that person commands, will be enough to influence the influence process.
If a doctor tells us that aspirin is better than Tylenol, we're likely to go out and buy aspirin.
Exactly. And of course it makes sense to do that, to listen to what a doctor has to say, because after all, this is someone who has all of the requisite training and credentials in the area. It's fascinating to me, however, that sometimes someone who just has the apparent title doctor or gives the impression of being a medical man produces the same kind of effect. My favorite example is the Robert Young Sanka coffee commercials, in which he tells us about the health-related benefits of drinking decaffeinated coffee, and he's been a very successful spokesperson for Sanka brand coffee in this regard. And he's been a very successful spokesperson for Sanka brand coffee. Why should he be that, given that his training and experience and credentials are as an actor rather than a physician? Well, if you understand that he is associated in most of our minds with the character Marcus Welby, MD, then all at once this begins to make sense. We're responding simply to the air of authority, the air of credibility that he presents, even though he doesn't truly have the substance of a medical authority. He still sells us an awful lot of coffee.
So that's the click-whir.
Yeah.
The click is, here is an authority, whir, he is telling us this, and therefore go ahead and do what he tells.
Right. Automatically outrolls in a kind of a mechanical way our positive response to what he has to say. Now, authority isn't the only click that produces this favorable response. I discuss at least five major other principles in my book, Influence, that also have this capacity to cause us, upon encountering one of these stimuli, one of these triggers, one of these clicks in our environment, to respond in a kind of unthinking, mechanical way and go along with the person who's asking for a request from us.
Now, these are really shortcuts to decision making, and usually, and most of the time, they help us make decisions in a
Right.
complex world, but they can also be used against us unsuspectingly to influence our behavior, and they're used by salespersons or advertisers. But let's talk for a minute about the usefulness of the prompts, the psychological prompts that we often tend to respond to.
Fine. I think we can use again this example of authority that we've been talking about so far in this regard. In most instances, it is very efficient and economical for us in terms of the way we spend our time thinking about issues to listen to what an authority figure has to say to us. After all, an authority figure has attained his or her level of expertise on an issue by virtue of superior knowledge or superior training or superior skill. That's how a legitimately constituted authority comes to be an authority. So it makes all sorts of sense most of the time to listen to what such a person says. We can just pick out one feature of a situation, what an authority has said, and not have to process or analyze or consider any of the other information in that situation. And most of the time we will be right. So it's a very economical strategy for us to use. The problem, of course, comes when we are not really listening to someone who's truly an expert or an authority, but someone who just gives the symbol of being an expert, like Robert Young on the Sanka brand coffee commercial.
Or even in a case where it may be an expert and if we think about it, give it a second thought, we disagree, it might behoove us still, even in that case, to bring in our cognitive function and not let the quick whir phenomenon keep on going.
Exactly. There are some instances where someone who is an acknowledged expert should still not be the person that we should rely exclusively on in a situation, because there are certain kinds of situations where an expert has a vested interest in having us believe what he or she wants us to believe. Under those circumstances, it's very important for us to ask ourselves the question, what is it that this person stands to gain from my compliance with his or her directive? And if we find that there is self-interest involved, oops, now it's time to unhook the mechanical response and look at all of the evidence in the situation ourselves and make a determination based on our own appreciation of that evidence rather than what someone else has said. And we find that indeed this idea of a trustworthy authority is one that is very important in much of the advertising that we see, for example, around us, where an individual is presented not just as an authority figure, but someone who is honest and straightforward in the presentation of that information.
All right, let's go now to some examples of how this automatic triggering based upon these decisions that we make commonly occur. And I'm thinking of examples that you have used often. One is the expensive is good relationship.
Yes.
Talk about that for a minute to see how that we can become fooled by what is usually a good association.
Right, and I think you're absolutely right. Usually it is the case that expensive equals good, doesn't it? You get what you pay for, and that's because the price associated with an object is usually correlated with the worth or the value of that object. And that's a nice little shortcut that we can often use to help us decide what constitutes good merchandise when we don't know anything about that product. A story that I like to tell, a friend of mine once called me. She was the owner of an Indian jewelry store in Arizona, and she called me to tell me this strange story that occurred to her. She was trying to sell a certain allotment of turquoise jewelry. It was not selling for some unknown reason, because she was asking really a very reasonable price for the quality of the merchandise, and the store was unusually full of tourists, and yet they weren't buying this allotment of jewelry, and she couldn't quite understand why that was the case. She tried a couple of standard sales tricks of moving it to a more central location in the store. That didn't work. She even asked her salespeople to try to push these items. That didn't work. And finally, out of exasperation, before she left on an overnight buying trip, she scribbled a note to her head saleswoman: "Everything in this display case, price times 1/2. She came back a couple of days later and was not surprised to find that all of the merchandise had sold out, but she was shocked to find that because the saleswoman had read her scribbled 1/2 as a 2, all the items had sold out at twice their original asking price. And that's when she called me, because she thought that as a psychologist I might be able to help her understand what had gone on. And I think we can understand that phenomenon in terms of what the tourists who were in her store wanted and what information they were using to get what they wanted. First of all, they were rather well-to-do people. They were looking for turquoise jewelry, but they knew nothing about it. And they didn't have the time or the energy or the inclination to go to the library and research what constitutes quality turquoise jewelry. They had to use a shortcut to decide what's good. And they wanted good jewelry, so they decided expensive equals good. That's why that allotment of jewelry wasn't selling initially. It was priced too reasonably. And that's why they swooped down on it when its price was doubled mistakenly, because they were living by the rule, you get what you pay for, expensive equals good. If this now costs $200 instead of $100, it must be good.
All right, so there was a case where the woman was not at all intentionally trying to be persuasive in a way that was not ethical. Indeed, but she learned a very important principle. There's another principle that is used often purposefully by people who are in the sales business, and that's the principle which you call the contrast principle that is used in sales.
Yes.
Give us a little bit about that.
Well, that's a fascinating principle that actually comes from the psychology of perception. It is the case that if I present two things to you in sequence, let's say that are different from one another. Let's say I ask you to lift a pencil, and then I ask you to lift a dining room chair. The chair will seem heavier to you after you first lifted a light object than if you hadn't lifted any object at all, because by contrast to this light stimulus, a heavy one seems heavier, so that I can essentially influence the way you perceive anything that I present to you by virtue of what I present to you immediately before.
Now, how can that be used in a negative way against us in the sales or the advertising business or in the compliance business?
Well, let's take an example that comes from real estate sales. There are some real estate companies that have on their lists houses that are rather run down and overpriced, so that customers can be shown them first, and then when the realtor shows them the house that he or she really had the couple spotted for, that house seems so much better in comparison to those others that they frequently jump for it in a way that they would not have done had their perceptions not been conditioned by those earlier run-down houses. So in contrast, the target house just seems more attractive, but it's really the same house. It's just what you presented before that makes the difference.
All right, let's go on now and discuss some of the 6 most common psychological triggers that get this click-whir response going. The first one you call reciprocation,
Yeah.
and that's the old tendency to give and take.
That's right. We feel a need to repay when someone has given us something due to what is called the rule for reciprocation in our culture. the rule for reciprocity. And it turns out that ours is not the only culture that subscribes to this rule that says we are obligated to return to a person the kind of behavior that that person has provided us. Every single society on earth lives by the rule for reciprocation, at least according to the anthropologists. There is not a single human society that does not work by that rule.
So usually if you do something for me, I feel indebted that I should do something back for you.
That's right. If I invite you to a birthday party, you better invite me to your birthday party if you're throwing one. If I give you a gift, you should give me one. If I do you a favor, you're indebted to return that favor when I need one.
And indeed, there's good cause for that.
Of course, it makes all sorts of sense within our society to live by this kind of reciprocal exchange rule where people can give to others without having the fear that they will be exploited, because there's a rule in the culture that says whatever you have done that's nice for someone else, you will reap in return. And interestingly, ours is the only species that lives by the rule of future obligation. And indeed, some anthropologists have claimed that as a consequence, we are the first species that can evolve certain kinds of social mechanisms that are greatly beneficial to the cultures in which we live. Organized systems of trade and defense and supply and trade of various kinds of goods and services can be provided because it's possible for one person to give to someone else without giving that thing away, because it's coming back by virtue of the rule that no other species lives by. And we have become the dominant species on this culture, some anthropologists like Robert Leakey have argued, precisely because we live by the rules of future obligation and exchange.
But it also can work against us.
It can work against us because if I do you a favor, you are now obligated to say yes to me when I ask for a favor from you. And if I want to manipulate you, I can first start out by doing you a little favor, knowing that what I really want to do is make you amenable to saying yes to the favor that I have in mind all along. And it might even be a larger one than the one I gave you. But you're likely to say yes because you don't want to break the rule that says you give back to the people who have given to you. You don't want to be assigned the label ingrate or moocher or welsher. Those are negatively laden terms in our culture, and to avoid sometimes the perception that you have taken without giving in return, you will give back more in order to rid yourself of the uncomfortable feeling of debt and the negative labels assigned to people in our culture who don't repay back debts.
Yeah, now an example of that I can think of and that you mention quite often is one that I think many of us have been confronted with, and that is when somebody is trying to elicit funds. They will first give you something,
Yes.
whether it's a religious organization that comes to your door and gives you their newsletter, or whether it's a cult member in an airport who gives you a flower. Talk about that for a minute.
Well, my favorite example is the airport illustration and the Hare Krishna Society, who approach us and ask for a donation only after they have given us something. It's crucial to their strategy that they foist some kind of gift on us. Sometimes it's a book, sometimes it's a magazine. In the most cost-efficient version and the most popular version, it's a flower. They walk up, pin it on our lapel, and this is instructive, will not take it back. If we offer to give them the flower back, they say, no, that is our gift to you. They leave us feeling obligated, and then they provide us with a way out of the obligation. However, if you would like to give a donation for the good works of the society, that would be greatly appreciated. And you find people who didn't want the flower in any sense paying $2 and $3 for it, not because of the merits of that exchange, They didn't want that flower, but because of a psychological pressure that they have now been put under to give back to those people who have given to you. Now, it's interesting that some people have tried to avoid the pressures of this rule for reciprocity with the Krishnas by taking the flower that they were given and saying, look, if you won't take it back, I'm throwing it down. I'm throwing it on the ground beneath the feet of passers-by. I will not keep this flower. And then they feel free to walk away. Now, isn't that instructive? It's not until they have divested themselves of this item that they feel free to break the bonds of that interaction. Right? You know what the Krishnas are doing to counteract that in some cities? They're now pinning small American flags on our lapels because no one will throw an American flag on the ground.
Now, that's wonderful.
Not us locked in the rules, locked in the jaws of the rule for reciprocity. They don't want us out because it's very profitable to have us in the jaws of that rule for them.
Now, you also say that in reciprocation, if there is an initial concession on the part of the person who is trying to elicit the yes response,
Yes.
that very often can lead to the desired action or the desired response.
That's the thing about the rule for reciprocation that's so powerful and general. It applies to all sorts of behaviors in our society besides just gifts and services and favors. It applies to things like concessions that people make to one another. If you and I are negotiating on some issue and we start out with positions that are incompatible with one another, I'm on one side, you're on another side, and you say to me, well, I'll tell you what, Bob, I'll move from my extreme initial position to a more moderate one in your direction. By virtue of the rule for reciprocation, I feel a pressure now to meet you halfway, to make a concession of my own, a reciprocal concession. And that, again, is in the best interests of society because that's how mutual compromises occur, and that's why we feel this pressure. We've been trained to give back the concessions that other people have given to us. Meeting the other fellow halfway, give and take, and so on. Those are all positive terms in our society. The problem comes in where someone starts with a large request from us, what we might say no to, and then retreats to a smaller request, the one that that person had in mind all along. And we feel pressured to say yes to the second request, not knowing that it was the crucial one in that person's mind from the outset. I had an example like that a few years ago. I was walking down a pathway at my home university and was approached by a little boy, about 11 years old. He was selling tickets to the Boy Scout circus to be held that Saturday evening. I declined. He said, well, the tickets were $5 a piece. I didn't think that I wanted to spend $5 a piece to spend the Saturday evening at the Boy Scout circus, so I said no. And then he said, well, if you can't do that, how about buying just a couple of our big chocolate bars here? They're only $1 a piece. And I bought a couple of his chocolate bars. And the intriguing thing to me is that I bought his chocolate bars even though I don't like chocolate. But I do like dollars. And he had my dollars, and I had his chocolate. Again, something other than the merits of the exchange got me to say yes to that request. It was the psychological pressure I felt to return something he had given to me. In this instance, what he had given to me was a concession, and I made a concession back, and he made the profit.
So I think we've seen very clearly how favors tend to make us want to return favors, how gifts tend to want to make us return gifts, how concessions tend to make us to want to make concessions. And in many instances, this is a very viable way of behaving. But we have mentioned ways that we are being manipulated by this kind of behavior. How do you learn to say no?
This completes the first part of our discussion. We continue on side 2. We now continue our discussion with Professor Cialdini.
I think the crucial thing to understand when you consider one of these situations. Suppose you find yourself in a situation in which someone has given you a gift or a favor or a concession, and then you later determine that that was not a genuine gift, favor, or concession. That was a piece of sales strategy designed to get you to make a gift, a larger favor, or a larger concession in return. As soon as you perceive that is the case, you can no longer feel bound by the rule for reciprocation, which says that I am obligated to return the kind of favor I have received with a similar kind of behavior. If someone has given me a little gift, but it's really a sales strategy, all I have to do is define it as a sales strategy, and then I don't have to give a gift back, because the rule doesn't say you give gifts back to people who have given you sales strategies. It only says that you should give gifts back to those people who give you gifts. So it's a matter of mentally redefining what you have been given, and then you're released from this pressure to play by the rule for reciprocation.
Let's move on now to the second way that we tend to sometimes respond automatically rather than thinking things through. And that has to do with commitment and consistency. You believe that these also can make us comply, that they can make us say yes, justify a decision. Can you give me some examples of that?
Sure. The principle of consistency is a very strong one in all of us. There is a need that we feel to stick by a course of action once we have taken a stand or made a commitment to it. So we're much more likely to say yes to a request that is consistent with an earlier commitment that we have made. Let me give you an example. A study that was done in the city of Toronto, I believe it was in conjunction with a United Way charity campaign. Prior to the week in which various neighborhoods in Toronto were to be canvassed by solicitors for the United Way, some researchers went around to every other house in these neighborhoods and asked individuals at the house if they would be willing to take a little lapel pin and wear it. The pin said, "Support your United Way." It was such a trivial, well-intentioned request that everyone complied. But that small favor was a committing favor, because now these people were on record as having supported, as wanting to support the United Way. When the actual drive for the United Way then occurred a week later, the people in these homes were nearly twice as likely to give a contribution than their neighbors who had not been asked to take that little lapel pin.
I like the example that you have also talked about, and that is how toy manufacturers are so adept at selling toys in January and February after the Christmas season.
Yes, that's always been a problem for toy manufacturers. After parents have spent their toy budgets on children's gifts during the Christmas holidays. Well, it's interesting that certain toy companies have found a way to increase their sales during those usually slack months by engaging the parents of children to make a small commitment to a certain kind of toy.
To that child.
To the child.
Yes, Johnny, you can
Yes.
have a robot.
Yes, Johnny, you can have a robot or a road race set.
Which has been highly advertised on
Yes,
television,
which-
and Johnny is
and
dying
Johnny
for.
is dying for it and has run to the parents and say, "I want the robot, I want the robot."
Christmas, for
Christmas. And the parent says, "Fine, I'll get you the robot." And now what the toy company does is undersupply the stores with these particular gifts, so that the parent goes to the store, is not able to find that particular gift, and has to buy some other product that the toy company has in its line, spend just as much money because they can't get the robot. Now, in January and February, they start the commercials again for the robot toy, let's say, and the child remembers, wait a minute, you promised, they go running to the parent says, all right, I made a commitment to you, I made a promise, and the parent trudges off to the store and buys the robot in January and February, so the toy company's profits extend not only from the Christmas season, but all the way into the early spring as well. And it's a marvelously effective strategy. By the way, if you look at what happened with the Cabbage Patch phenomenon, that's precisely the sequence of events.
Let's move on now to the third factor that can influence us, and that is social proof. What do you mean by social proof, and can you give me some examples?
I think I mean consensus by social proof is probably the best way to say it. We often decide what is correct behavior for ourselves in a situation by looking at how others like us are behaving there. That is, we tend to say yes to a request if we see that others like us are saying yes. So we find, for example, that various kinds of advertisers will give us information that everybody's doing this. This is the largest selling, the fastest growing product in the market. If we take that evidence of what people like us have done to help us decide what is appropriate behavior for ourselves in that situation. Now, the unfortunate thing is that sometimes that information can be counterfeited, and that information can be falsified. There was a study done on one charity organization that used something called the list technique. They would go from door to door collecting for charity, carrying a list of names of other people who had given to the organization. And what they found was that the longer the list that they showed a homeowner, the more likely that person was to give a donation. And what's more, the larger the average donation on that list, the larger the donation from someone to whom it was shown. We decide what we should do based on what the people around us have been doing. Well, certain unscrupulous organizations don't just collect names, they create names and they create amounts to make us think that this is what we should be doing in this situation because everyone around us seemingly has been doing that.
You say that we are most influenced by people who are similar to ourselves.
Exactly. Because the decision that we're making is, how should I be behaving in this situation? A very valuable source of information concerning that question, how are people like me behaving? And we find that the similar individual provides the most influence.
How do we say no to separate out the correct social proof from the incorrect manufactured social proof? And I'm thinking of such things like how they use laugh tracks on TV programs, and curiously it does make us laugh at some pretty stupid jokes because
Right.
everybody else seems to be laughing. How do we guard ourselves against that?
Well, I think we have to recognize the power of this technique. And whenever we find ourselves in that situation where we're being told that we should get this product because it's the largest selling, we have to take a step back from the situation and once again assess our interest in the product independent from the kind of evidence that might have been falsified by the advertiser.
Let's move on now to the fourth factor that often leads to compliance, and that's liking, which
Yes.
is no surprise, really. And I love your example of the Tupperware party.
Yes, well, of course it's the case that we tend to say yes to the people we like, and in fact the Tupperware party has engaged this very powerful principle in the way that they work the home party concept. You are brought to the home of a friend or a relative or a neighbor, someone you have connections with, someone you like, and you know that for every piece of Tupperware you buy or for every item that you purchase, your friend gets a percentage. So now you are not buying any longer from a stranger across a counter in a department store. You are buying from and for a friend of yours. And as a consequence of that very powerful pressure, the Tupperware company makes $1 million a day, and there is a Tupperware party that starts somewhere in the world every 30 seconds.
And it's even better than that, because as you point out, in their way of selling, they combine reciprocity, commitment, social proof, and liking.
I think the Tupperware party is the consummate compliance setting of our society. They incorporate all of these strategies that we've already talked about.
All right, now, what are the factors that somebody who's in the compliance business can use to get us to like him or her?
One thing that contributes to liking is some similarity. We like those people who are like us. So, for example, car sales people are trained when they look at the trade-in car that we bring to the new car showroom to look not just for rust spots and dents, but to look for cues as to the kind of person that we are, that the driver of that car is. Let's say the salesperson sees golf balls on the back seat. A little later on in the conversation, the salesperson might say, well, you know, I hope the weather holds for this weekend because I'm looking forward to getting out and getting 18 holes in. How about you? Do you like golf? And you say, well, yes, I do. And you begin a conversation, and already there's a bond between you that didn't exist before because this person is like you, and we like the people who are like us.
And there's also, you say that people who are physically attractive.
People who are
tend to be-
physically attractive are liked, and that leads to their ability to be more persuasive and to be more influential, even in such institutions of our society as the courts. There's a fascinating study that was done by a psychologist named John Stewart on some cases in the Pennsylvania court system where he and his researchers went in at the beginning of a variety of criminal cases and rated the physical attractiveness of the defendant, matched the cases on all other respects, severity of the crime and so on, repeat performance of the crime, and later went back about a year later to see what the judgments were at the end of all of these trials. And they found that the physically attractive defendants were only half as likely to be sent to jail as the physically unattractive defendants. Now that's scary.
It certainly is. Also, you say that simply contact with an individual can increase liking, that cooperation can increase liking.
Yes.
And that, of course, compliments.
All of those. And I would say, however, that the kind of contact that leads to liking is the kind that incorporates those other two. If we can have a cooperative, complementary experience with someone else, then the more we contact that person, the much more that person will like us.
Now we come to the fifth factor which influences us to do things, and that is authority, which we've also touched on somewhat earlier in the interview. But how are we influenced by authority?
Well, I think authority allows us to be influenced in a couple of ways. One way that's a little distressing, actually, to me, and as I watched it occur, sometimes we can be influenced by just the symbols of authority rather than the substance of it. We talked a little bit about Robert Young, the actor, who has the association with Marcus Welby, MD, and was very successful then as a persuader. Other kinds of symbols that lend themselves to authority and subsequent influence are the clothing that a person wears. There was a neat little study done in Texas a few years ago that showed that a man who crossed the street against the light into traffic was 3 times more successful at bringing other people into traffic with him, behind him, if he was wearing a suit and tie as opposed to just an open-neck shirt and slacks. So merely having the air of authority caused people to defer to this individual's behavior when it came to something as simple as when to cross the street. Another symbol of authority in our society is the automobile. We have a love affair with the automobile, and it turns out that we're willing to defer, we're willing to give advantages to people who are driving prestige automobiles. There was a study done in the San Francisco Bay Area, for example, that showed that if researchers took a high-priced prestige automobile and drove up to a red light, and when the green light came on, just sat there, people were reluctant to honk their horns at such an individual. But when the researchers drove an economy car up to that light, and when the light turned green, sat there, there was an immediate response from the car behind them. We're not going to put up with that sort of behavior from the low prestige individual, but the person who has the air of authority gets away with all sorts of advantages in our culture. And it can be something as simple as a mere symbol of authority, like an automobile or a suit of clothes.
And finally, we come to scarcity. You say that the rule of the availability or unavailability of something really has an impact on our decision making.
Yes, we tend to want those things more that are scarce or whose availability is dwindling to us. In fact, that's how I bought my last television set, although it was before I wrote my book and learned how these principles work. But I was in an appliance store and just kind of looking around, doing some window shopping, and I saw a particular set and it was on sale. And I was looking at it, and the salesperson came up and said to me, "Well, I see you're interested in this set over here, but unfortunately, that's our last model, and a woman just called to say that she's on her way to come and pick it up." 5 minutes later, Margie, I was walking out of the store with that set under my arm, even though I hadn't gone in to buy it. But because the competition for scarce resources is such a powerful way to get us to want something, irrelevant of the merits of the thing, it was decidedly effective in my case.
It became a very desirable item.
It became more desirable because it was scarce, because I was competing for it.
Yeah, I can think of the scarcity principle, how it's also used in advertising, where they tell you this is the last chance you have to buy this item at this very lowest of all possible prices. So
Yes.
they put a time limit on it. Not only is it the number of goods that's available, but it's the price at which.
In fact, when I was researching my book, I took some training as an appliance salesman, and one strategy that was often used in a store that I worked was to tell a customer that was, say a couple was interested in a refrigerator, looking around, but not actively coming and asking for help. The salesperson would go up and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, that model has just been sold, and if I'm not mistaken, that's the last one we have in stock." So you tell people that they can't have it anymore, and that really makes them want it, and they say, "Well, wait a minute, you mean we can't have this? Could you check in the back room or check your other locations to see if we've got it?" And the salesperson would say, "Well, do I understand then that if I can find one of these at this price, that you're interested?" And they say, "Yes, because this is the time when they want it most." And the salesman, of course, goes back to the back room where there's plenty and says, "Guess what? We found one at another location." And he returns with a contract in hand, which people then sign because they've committed themselves to this object when it was so desirably unavailable.
So I suppose one of the things that one should do to guard against being taken in by scarcity, which is an inappropriate prompt, is to make the decision before you know it's scarce. Is this the product I really want?
Right. And in those situations where you don't ask yourself that question beforehand, when you catch yourself feeling this kind of rush of arousal and desire for a product just because you've been told that it's scarce, that's the thing that should cue you to stop short.
Another thing you say is that if you learn to understand that the scarcity principle also means that sometimes it's the joy in possessing the item rather than experiencing it that makes it so desirable, helps you separate out something that you should be interested in actually purchasing and not.
Right. Let's take the example of a coin or some kind of object that people usually collect, stamps as an example, because they are scarce. Well, if your reason for possessing an item is because it is scarce, then fine, use the availability or unavailability of that object as a cue to tell you how much you want this thing. But there are all sorts of other objects that are not made any more valuable by the fact that there are other people who are interested in them. If you want something to ride in or to drive or to taste or to eat or to drink, and your purpose is to use that item, you have to remember that it will not work any better because it has been made to seem scarce to you. It's only those things that you want to possess for their rarity that should work that way.
So there are things that are scarce that we indeed want because they're scarce.
Exactly, and that's fine, but we have to understand which those are and not generalize this principle to the things that we want because of their utilitarian value.
How would you sum up the basic stance that we ought to take that will maximize our chances of not falling under the negative influence of the compliance expert?
Well, I think the most important thing is to be able to recognize each of these principles that we've talked about. And I hope we've given enough illustrations and examples so that when an individual encounters one of these pressures, it will set off a little flag in that person's head that will say, oh, case where authority influence is being used on me, or here's a case where scarcity is being used in the presentation of this product. And at that point, when the flag goes up, we need to step back a little bit and say, all right, do I want the product for its own sake? Is it the merits of what I am being offered that will make me decide to buy it or take it? Or is it the way in which that product or service is being presented to me that makes it seem so attractive? And separate the psychology of the presentation from the substance of the thing and make your decision based on the pros and cons of the thing rather than the mode by which it was presented to you.
And I think that we should make very clear, too, that in all of these discussions, we're talking not only about things, but we're talking about beliefs, we're talking about requests that are made of us by our parents, by our children, by our bosses, by our colleagues, that all of these operate not only in the compliance industry, but in our daily lives.
Right. And I think it's also important to say that not all individuals who are involved in sales or advertising or fundraising are misusing these principles. In fact, many of them are using them in a wholly fair and honest way, if indeed there is expert or authority evidence in favor of a given position. It's not illegitimate for an individual to present that evidence. It's only illegitimate if that evidence is counterfeited or falsified in some way to make us think that an authority is spoken. So these principles have to be seen as very adaptive and efficient ways for us to decide. Most of the time, the only time we have to watch out for them is when someone presents us just the symbol without the substance of one of those principles.
I think on that note, I can say thank you very much, Robert Cialdini.
This concludes our discussion with Professor Robert B. Cialdini. You have been listening to one in a series of Psychology Today cassettes on subjects in the behavioral and social sciences.